Welcome to your Muscle Contraction Vodcast. Today we are going to talk about how muscles do their work. And by work, we mean all of the things we talked about with muscles. Heartbeat, body temperature, posture, movement, moving of body fluids, all of that is muscle work. So before we understand or can understand contractions, we have to understand the structure of the two proteins that are really involved in contraction. And the first protein that is involved is the myosin protein. And the myosin protein, again, is the thick protein. And the myosin protein is made up of many filaments, so we have a bunch of different filaments here, and each of those filaments has a bulby part at the end that we call a cross bridge. And so it's really, to make up a molecule, we have a lot of threads, and then we have those cross bridges at the end. The other protein that is highly important is the actin protein. And the actin protein, if you remember, is the thin protein. It's much thinner in diameter. And it is kind of like the shape of DNA. It is two strands of actin filaments that are twisted into a double helix. And then we also, as part of actin, have two additional proteins. We have one on the top here that rides on the top that's called tropomyosin, and then we have the ones that are embedded, kind of like Mickey Mouse, and those are called the troponin proteins. So actually actin is three proteins, and it has two shapes depending on whether it is considered open or closed. And so the closed means that we don't see any of the binding sites that are the purple here, and when it's open we do see those sites, and that's going to become important to how muscles contract. So let's go ahead and label this together so you have a copy of this in your notes. Again, this is the myosin molecule, and it is made up of individual myosin filaments. And then we also have the globular part, the bulby part, and that is the cross bridge. And then we also have over here, we have the actin molecule. And the actin molecule is made up of two smaller proteins, tropomyosin, and then we have troponin. And then each of these is a separate actin filament. So there you have it, actin and myosin labeling. And here we are seeing the actin in the closed position. So muscle contraction in a nutshell, when a muscle contracts, what's happening is those two filaments, the myosin and the actin, are sliding past one another, and that is causing the sarcomere, or the unit of the muscle fiber, to shorten. So here you see the length when a muscle is relaxed, and then down here you see the length when a muscle has fully contracted, and that distance is a lot shorter. That is what allows muscles to pull on the things they're attached to, like your bones. If you notice, nothing has actually changed shape or length here. The pink stays the same length, and the purple stays the same length. It's just that when it's fully contracted, those things, those elements have slid past one another, and that's what causes that shortening to occur. So we have a couple steps of muscle contraction that we need to talk about. And the first one is that the neuron, or your nervous system, releases acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is the first chemical messenger. And when that happens, sodium ions are taken in by the muscle, and that generates what's called a muscle impulse. The third thing is that muscle impulse travels through your muscle, and it causes calcium ions to be released. And if you remember, sodium ions are written as Na+, and calcium ions are written as Ca+. And when that calcium is released, it is what signals your sarcomeres to shorten by having the actin and the myosin actually slide past one another. So the calcium is the last chemical signal. So let's look at each of those kind of a little bit more in depth. So again, the stimulus. So the stimulus is that you have the first chemical signal being sent, and that happens from the nerve cell. This yellow part again here is the neuron. Sorry, I didn't have my pen. So nerve down here, muscle, and what's happening is all of the acetylcholine here that's stored is being released into this space, which is the synapse. And when that happens, it is what's going to signal the muscle down here to contract. The second thing that happens once that acetylcholine has been released, so here it's a different picture, but we have our acetylcholine here in the synapse, is that it causes sodium ions to start entering the muscle. Here we have a sodium, here we have a sodium, and they're coming into the muscle. So sodium is our second chemical signaler. Acetylcholine is the first, sodium is the second, and that's what generates that muscle impulse. So you have a diagram to label as part of your notes packet. So let's go ahead and label that together. So here we have our neuron, and here down here we have our muscle. Here we have our ACH, our acetylcholine. We have a bunch of them. Down here we have our sodium, and here is our sodium gate. And that's what allows the sodium to come into the muscle. So nerve, acetylcholine, sodium, sodium gate, and the muscle. So now I want you to watch, since we have this diagrammed, I would like you to watch, one more thing. And this is the synapse, this space right here. So I want you to watch what happens as I explain when a muscle impulse is generated. So your brain sends a signal, and that signal comes down your neuron, and when it reaches the end of your neuron, it signals all of those acetylcholines to be released into the synapse. So here in a second, you're going to start seeing there they go, all the acetylcholines being released into the synapse. Those acetylcholine molecules join to the sodium gates, and when they do, they open those gates, and until they open, nothing can go through them. As soon as they're open, sodium starts going in, so it's our second chemical signal, and once enough sodium builds up inside the muscle, that's going to trigger our next event. So it's a series of dominoes here, a series of chemical signals that are allowing for muscle contraction. Okay, so the third chemical signal is calcium. So as here our sodium comes in, so we'll have sodium coming in through these sodium channels, it's going to cause the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is all around our muscle fiber here, the yellow, so sarcoplasmic reticulum, to release calcium. And that calcium goes into the myofibrils, and as it does, it is what is going to open those sites on the actin filament. So let's go ahead and diagram that to make sure you have everything in your notes. So please make sure that you have the sarcoplasmic reticulum diagrammed, the yellow here. Make sure you have the calcium molecules. Draw the arrows to show that those calcium molecules are going into the muscle fibers. So draw a couple of them. And when that happens, that's the big picture. Over here we have our small picture. So here we're actually looking at these filaments here and here. So calcium is coming in, comes in. Here we have the actin molecule closed. And when that calcium comes in, that's what causes the opening of our actin. So now we see those binding sites open and ready to receive this down here. So the next step after the calcium is released is that calcium opens those actin molecules. And when they're open, they can now join with the myosin. So here, down here is where we see the join. So this is what is called a cross-bridge cycling. So we have the cross-bridge and the actin joined. And what's going to happen is that each one of these cross bridges latches on, and they all move the actin molecule or slide it in one direction. So the myosin attaches, and what happens is each one pulls, and it would be like you pulling up a heavy object that's suspended on a rope. So let's look at a picture of what that would look like. So as we have our energy molecules coming in to supply the energy for this, we see how that myosin is grabbing that actin and just pulling it and sliding it. And it does that until the muscle is fully contracted. So again, here's the big picture. Let's make sure we have our diagram filled out. So we have our calcium coming in, and as the calcium comes in, we see that the cross bridge is in kind of a straight position. They attach together, so we're working our way down this way. And then it goes from being in a straight position to being kind of in a cocked position. And each one of them does that, and that's what causes that actin to slide this direction. It'll let go, it'll go back to being in that straight position, and then it'll start the process all over again, and it will grab the molecule a little bit further down and pull it one more time until our muscle is shortened or our sarcomere is shortened. So the model for this, or what we call this process, is the sliding filament model. And the sliding filament model means that one or those two proteins, the actin and the myosin, are sliding past one another, and that's what's causing that sarcomere distance to shorten from this down here to this. And again, it's really important to know that there is no change in length. Okay, we're not changing length here. The pink is staying the same length. The purple is staying the same length. It's just that now we have some overlap here. Okay? So just to show you what that looks like when we see that.
In a relaxed muscle, actin and myosin myofilaments lie side by side, and the H zones and I band are at maximum width. During contraction, the actin and myosin myofilaments interact. The actins are pulled toward the center of each myosin myofilament. As a result, the sarcomeres shorten. In the fully contracted muscle, the ends of the actin myofilaments overlap. The H zones disappear, and the I band becomes very narrow.
So one of the big reasons that I had you learn all the different parts of the sarcomere is so that you could see what happened when the muscle contracted. So again, we see that H zone disappear as the muscle contracts because we have these things being pulled towards one another, and we see that I band getting very narrow. Okay, so to do this and to do work in your body, you have to have an energy supply. And in the body, that energy supply comes in the form of ATP. That stands for adenosine triphosphate, because it has 3 phosphates, tri for 3. And what happens is, as you use energy from that molecule, you lose one of the phosphates and you go down to 2. That's a problem because you need to have a continuous supply of energy. So something needs to recharge that molecule that now has 2 back into the triphosphate that has 3. So what does that in the body is a molecule called creatine phosphate. We call it the ATP recharger. And creatine phosphate is actually a supplement that a lot of bodybuilders take because they feel like it will help them to regenerate their energy even faster. Just an interesting little side bit there. But ATP is what supplies all of our energy. Now, when your muscle is contracted, you probably don't want them to stay contracted forever. At some point, your muscles need to relax. Otherwise, it can become painful. So 2 things have to happen for your muscles to react or relax. The first one is that you have to get rid of acetylcholine. Since acetylcholine is the first chemical signal for contraction, it would make sense that it would need to go for your muscles to relax. So there is an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. I know that's a really long word, but that acetylcholinesterase basically comes in and it gets rid of all of that acetylcholine that was in that space that was near the muscle. So that's the first thing that has to happen. The second thing that has to happen is that you have to get rid of the third chemical signal, and that is you have to get rid of the calcium. So the calcium ions that were around all of the muscle fibers here have to go from the muscle fibers back into the other direction here, into the sarcoplasmic reticulum to be stored again. So we get rid of acetylcholine, we get rid of calcium, and that leaves us with a nice relaxed muscle. Okay, so lastly, one thing I want to talk about is how your body really needs oxygen and why. Why do you breathe? The reason you breathe is because oxygen is what allows your body to make ATP. If you don't have oxygen, you're not going to make ATP. Once oxygen is made, you have to get it to all of your muscles for your muscles to be able to do their work, to make more ATP in the muscle. And that's done by the blood. And you have two pigments that work to circulate oxygen around your body. The first one is hemoglobin, and that's in your red blood cells, and it carries oxygen and circulates it all throughout your body. But your muscles also have a pigment in them that can store oxygen, and that's really important for those times when you don't have a good blood supply, or your blood supply is slower because you're really exercising very heavily and you're just not getting the oxygen from your blood that you should be. Your muscles can store some, and you can use it in times of crisis. All right, so in terms of oxygen requirements, you have two pathways with which you can go to make a little bit of energy. And the first pathway is when you have oxygen, and it is called aerobic respiration because you have air. And it's what makes the most ATP. And it's the one that you want to be in when you are doing physical exercise. The other pathway is when you don't have oxygen, and that's what we call anaerobic. And that is a fermentation pathway. And instead of producing ATP there, your body starts producing lactic acid. And lactic acid is what is not good, and it's what makes you sore and tired. So again, anaerobic respiration leads to production of lactic acid. And lactic acid I just want to talk about for a second. That's what you start to accumulate in your muscles. And when you start to accumulate, that's when you start to feel that burn in your muscles, that tired feeling, that soreness. The lactic acid just gets built up and built up if you don't have enough oxygen, if you're called oxygen debt. And when you store a lot of that lactic acid, until you remove it, your muscles remain sore. So one of the best things that you can do after exercising really heavily is to walk to circulate the lactic acid out of your muscles. And the reason that it makes your muscles so sore is that as you accumulate it, it lowers the pH of your muscles. And when you have a lower pH, it affects all of those other processes that we talked about for contraction. It's one of those things that you have to maintain in your body is a proper pH, and lactic acid doesn't allow you to do that. So that's why it's not such a good thing. Muscle fatigue is another thing that can happen with muscle contractions that have been too long. So muscle fatigue happens if you've really been exercising a lot. Your muscles get really tired. You can even get to the point where you collapse. That doesn't happen to most of us, but I found an interesting video that I thought was cool that shows what happens when you get to that point where your muscles are so tired that they just can no longer answer what you want them to do. This is from the Ironman in Hawaii.
Sean Welch is in a desperate spot. Her body has run out of fuel. No calories to burn. Systems shutting down. The lights are there, you just can't feel them. The eyes still see, but through a gauzy veil of delirium. At this point, Sean Welch is aware of two things. The finish line is so close, and someone is so close behind. After more than 140 miles, it's come down to less than 100 feet to that damn line. Just yards behind, her stalker appears. It's Wendy Ingram.
Just so you don't think that those women are weak, the Ironman is one of the toughest races that you can do. It is a 2.2 mile swim, 110 mile bike ride, and then a full marathon, which is 26 miles. So they had a reason to collapse. But fatigue can be caused by lots of different things. The first thing it can be caused by is not having a good blood supply. Your blood, again, carries your oxygen, which makes your ATP. And so if you're not getting the blood that you need, then you're not getting the oxygen and you're not making your ATP. So your muscles can't do their work. The second thing you need is acetylcholine. And if you don't have enough acetylcholine for whatever reason, genetic disorder, poison, some problem, that's going to affect how your muscles contract. And the last is the one we just talked about. If you have a buildup of lactic acid in your muscles, which is what was happening with the women we just saw, then the pH is lowered and your muscles just can't contract anymore. And when the lactic acid gets so much, like we just saw, then you can have that collapse and that severe muscle fatigue. The last thing we need to talk about is muscle cramps. They're a minor form of a bad muscle contraction, although they can hurt if you've ever had a Charlie horse. But it's basically where you have an involuntary sustained contraction. So your muscle is contracting without you wanting it to contract. And you can't make it stop, you just have to wait for it to end. And the most common cause of this is that you have an imbalance in the fluid around your muscles. That fluid is what has all of your ions, those sodium ions and those calcium ions. And so if you don't have the proper amount of those ions, which we call electrolytes together, then that means that your muscles aren't signaling like they should. And it can cause issues like this muscle cramping or muscle fatigue. One of the things that athletes do to make sure that they keep that balance is to replace their electrolytes. And that's done by sports drinks, and there's powders, and there's coconut milk. There's lots of things that can do that. All right, we have finished. So you need to call me over so that I can check your notes because you get a grade for them now. And then you need to log on to see what's next that you should do on the daily blog. Thanks for watching.